Recently, the history concerning Nanking Massacre, one of the biggest atrocities occurred during the Second World War by Japanese troops here in China, has become the theme of many movies, both made in China and Europe. Once being termed as the forgotten Holocaust, many ask the question, why now it has finally become the center of attention, and how would this part of history being portrayed in the movies help us to seek remembrance and reconciliation decades afterward? To answer those questions, I'm joined in the studio by a very strong panel. In the middle, we have Mr. Florian Gallenberger. He is the screenwriter and also director of the movie called Jean Rabais. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Hi.
Over there, we have the actor from the movie City of Life and Death, Sam Voutas. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Meanwhile, we have in our studio Professor Teng Jimeng, our longtime friend and Chinese film critic as well. Well, really, it's very hard to distinguish, maybe for many viewers who haven't watched the two movies, both The City of Life and Death and also Jean Rabais, to distinguish the two stories. Maybe you two can brief us a little bit about the distinction that you would make between the two movies. Let's go from Sam first.
Sure. Well, The City of Life and Death, I guess, is a very...
Or called Nanking.
Oh, okay, Nanking. Is a very cinema verite style, documentary style feature film that follows the rape of Nanking through several different perspectives. On one hand, there's the Japanese story, which is followed throughout the course of the film, but also very much on the Chinese resistance fighters and also the civilians who are acting doing motions or movements of resistance. I mean, we had the 70th anniversary just 2 years ago, and that said, these films have been in production for a very long time, so these have been in the works, but it's only just coming out now.
But the Chinese
I know you also have, just by the way, I know you also have a personal story linked to the movie itself.
That's correct.
The role that you play was actually a good friend of your grandpa.
That's correct, and actually the director Lu Chuan only found out after I was cast. But the good friend was Frank Tillman Durdin, who was a war reporter in Nanjing at the time.
But then, of course, there is the question of whether a movie is exactly the history. And how much responsibility would movie makers like you or film critics like you have when it comes to choosing your stories about these movies? How do you see that, Sam?
Well, any movie about a historical event can only be a representation. It can never be a 100% reenactment of what's happening. So I think, but from an actor's perspective, the best that you can do is try to create emotional realism and try to be as honest for the characters as you can.
Can you give us an example of how you did your
Sure.
role?
For example, many times we'd be doing a take, and the director would...
You were doing a reporter during the Second World War. New Yorker reporter.
A New York reporter. And as an actor, you often get maybe stuck in a rut. You always repeat. And in Nanjing, the director never wanted us to repeat. He always wanted realism. He wanted spontaneity. And I really respected that.
We know that Nanking, or rather the English version, The City of Life and Death, also has its own choices when it comes to stories. Your director, Lu Chuan, for example, said it the other day in an interview that he saw before it was really to show the weakness and a troubled Chinese during the massacre, which of course was part of the story, but he said he would rather to show some resilience of the people during that period of time in his movies. But then people would also ask the same question. Is that resilience the whole picture, or it's only 20% or 30%, and it's appropriate to choose a theme totally depend on that? What is your response to those critics?
Well, I think Lu Chuan was, in very many ways, just trying to tell several different aspects of the story. I think he probably would admit that it's impossible to tell the whole story. And so the characters that he chose in those movies, in Nanjing, in many ways represent the resistance that he felt was lacking in historical documents or in perhaps in other movies that have been made in the past.
The average age of the crew, 35 years old. Can we imagine that for such an epic movie? And 20,000 volunteers, I heard, from universities in China volunteered to play a role or do some work for that movie. What does it mean to portray such a grand scale history by such a young cast? And what does that experience teach you personally?
Well, even though the cast was very young and the crew was very young, they were all very much touched emotionally by the story. For example, one of the Japanese soldiers, his grandparents had lived in Manchuria in the 1930s, and of course many of the actors were from Nanjing. Just the fact that so many people were willing to travel so far to work on this movie, I think, is just shows you how important this was for them emotionally.
And what about you?
Me too, definitely. For me, this was a very, you had a very strong weight of responsibility on this movie.
I heard a lot of actors and actresses have a very hard time coming out of their role, the role they play, after years with the crew and after learning the history in such a depth that they wouldn't if they were not in the movie. Do you also feel the same way? Did you compare notes with your family who also has a link to that part of history?
I did. I was in touch with my grandfather quite often, just asking him questions about it, and also, of course, reading the material. But it is hard. You finish work at the end of the day, and it is hard to relax. You obviously have a responsibility to try to portray it as truthfully the next day. I think for us as a human race to move forward, we also have to look back and ponder what's happened in the past, and by doing so, hopefully the future generations won't make the same mistakes.
Mm-hmm. But let me ask you, do you think a cultural piece would change the world's attitude? How much an impact would a cultural piece really have? Sam?
Well, I think one can only try one's best, and I'm sure that for director Lu Chuan, he definitely wanted to make a change. And I can certainly guarantee you that he did his darndest to try to make the best movie that he could, to reach as many people as he could.
What about you?
I certainly did my darndest as well. No.
When you were doing that reporter, though it was a minor role.
It was a minor role. It was a minor role, but at the same time, it's an ensemble film, and a lot of the moments in the movie aren't expressed through dialogue, but through the human faces.
Do you still remember one of those moments you did?
Yes, many, many a moment. Lu Chuan would often say, "Don't worry about the dialogue. Just look at this person, and so long as it's real, that's what I'm looking for."
That's probably what we will do as well in the movie theater. Just look, just watch.